Hello there, and welcome to this calming exploration of the past. Tonight, we are going to set aside the noise and pace of the present and step into a world that is both fascinating and rather dreadful, though we'll approach it slowly, gently, and in a way that will hopefully lull you to sleep while still feeding your curiosity. Our subject is the world of medieval Europe, a world of castles and kings, but also of mud and hunger. The truth is that even one day in that world could test the modern person more than we might imagine. And that's why this long journey is called Why You Wouldn't Last a Day in Medieval Times, along with quiet wanderings into other corners of history. It's both a bedtime story and a historical immersion, meant to soothe your mind and maybe even help you dream of ages long past. So let's imagine for a moment that you wake up not in your own bed, but in the 14th century. The first thing you would notice is the smell. We live in a world where soap, toothpaste, clean running water, and scented detergents are taken for granted. In medieval Europe, the overwhelming scent of humanity, animals, wood smoke, and refuse was inescapable. Streets ran with all sorts of waste, chamber pots were emptied into alleys, and farms butted right up against towns, so the odor of livestock mingled freely with every breath. That smell alone would probably keep many modern people from lasting very long, or at least from enjoying their breakfast. But speaking of breakfast, if you were a peasant in medieval Europe, and most people were, you would not sit down to toasted bread with butter and coffee. Your morning meal would likely be a thick porridge made from grains like oats, rye, or barley, boiled up slowly over the fire. It would be coarse, lumpy, and not especially flavorful. If you were lucky, there might be a topping of onions, beans, or maybe some cheese, but often it was plain gruel. Water wasn't safe to drink much of the time, and so ale was the usual beverage, even for children. Don't imagine a frothing mug of golden beer. It was a weak, mildly alcoholic drink, just enough to kill off germs but hardly a celebratory pint. A medieval morning was not about indulgence but about fuel, plain and simple. Now after eating, you'd begin your day's work. Most peasants lived on manorial estates under the authority of a lord who owned their land. Families were tied to the soil generation after generation. The work was relentless, bound to the rhythm of the seasons, and almost entirely physical. Men, women, and children alike labored in the fields, often from sunrise to sunset, planting, weeding, harvesting, or tending livestock. A modern person might last a few hours of this work before muscles gave out or blisters formed. Imagine stooping to pull weeds for hours or hauling water from a well dozens of times a day. That was life, and there was no option of going home early to rest on the couch. There was no couch at all, only rough benches and straw pallets to sit or lay upon once the labor was mercifully done. Clothing would not offer much comfort either. Forget soft cotton t-shirts or tailored jeans. Medieval peasants wore rough linen undergarments and coarse wool tunics or dresses. Imagine wool in summer heat, itchy and unwashed for long periods of time. Footwear was basic leather, often patched or falling apart. Cleaning outfits was not easy since laundry meant hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing with lye, and drying garments in the sun. Most people owned just one or two sets of clothing to rotate. Bathing was rare too, sometimes only a handful of times in an entire year. So the itchiness and dirtiness of daily life quickly added up. Just surviving one day in such clothing would be humbling. Medical reality in medieval times was another matter that might break modern endurance quickly. Small wounds could become infected easily, and something as common as a toothache could spiral into life-threatening infection without modern medicine. Hospitals existed, but were not what we might call hospitals. They were often run by monasteries and focused more on prayer than on scientific cures. Bloodletting was a favoured treatment. Imagine a medieval barber surgeon deciding that your fever meant he should open your veins to let the bad humours out. The very thought is enough to make us grateful for modern medicine. A single migraine or stomach bug could become miserable beyond tolerance without proper remedies. And the absence of modern comforts like aspirin or cozy blankets would make even a short illness unbearable. Yet cities and towns held even greater challenges. If you wandered into a medieval city, the streets would be narrow, muddy, and noisy. Pigs and dogs ran freely. Markets clattered with merchants hawking fish, cloth, and spices, and beggars lined the squares. Disease spread rapidly in such close quarters, with outbreaks of plague, a recurring terror. The infamous Black Death of the 14th century wiped out perhaps half of Europe's population. Imagine living one day in such constant fear, when merely brushing shoulders with someone could feel fatal. The stress of existing with that shadow overhead would weigh on the mind like a heavy stone. Even the food for those living in towns was tough on modern palates. Bread was a staple, but often coarse, mixed with ground beans or peas to stretch the wheat. Meat was a rarity for poor families, perhaps a salted bit of pork only on feast days. Fish and broth were more common, though without refrigeration, preservation meant salting or smoking meat into rubbery toughness. Fruits or vegetables were seasonal, and hunger was always near. Malnutrition was widespread, leading to stunted growth and frailty. Just imagine spending one day without the abundance of snacks, coffee shops, or supermarkets that we casually browse through now. Hello there, and welcome to this calming exploration of the past. Tonight, we are going to set aside the noise and pace of the present and step into a world that is both fascinating and rather dreadful, though we'll approach it slowly, gently, and in a way that will hopefully lull you to sleep while still feeding your curiosity. Our subject is the world of medieval Europe, a world of castles and kings, but also of mud and hunger. The truth is that even one day in that world could test the modern person more than we might imagine. And that's why this long journey is called Why You Wouldn't Last a Day in Medieval Times, along with quiet wanderings into other corners of history. It's both a bedtime story and a historical immersion, meant to soothe your mind and maybe even help you dream of ages long past. So let's imagine for a moment that you wake up not in your own bed, but in the 14th century. The first thing you would notice is the smell. We live in a world where soap, toothpaste, clean running water, and scented detergents are taken for granted. In medieval Europe, the overwhelming scent of humanity, animals, wood smoke, and refuse was inescapable. Streets ran with all sorts of waste, chamber pots were emptied into alleys, and farms butted right up against towns, so the odor of livestock mingled freely with every breath. That smell alone would probably keep many modern people from lasting very long, or at least from enjoying their breakfast. But speaking of breakfast, if you were a peasant in medieval Europe, and most people were, you would not sit down to toasted bread with butter and coffee. Your morning meal would likely be a thick porridge made from grains like oats, rye, or barley, boiled up slowly over the fire. It would be coarse, lumpy, and not especially flavorful. If you were lucky, there might be a topping of onions, beans, or maybe some cheese, but often it was plain gruel. Water wasn't safe to drink much of the time, and so ale was the usual beverage, even for children. Don't imagine a frothing mug of golden beer. It was a weak, mildly alcoholic drink, just enough to kill off germs but hardly a celebratory pint. A medieval morning was not about indulgence but about fuel, plain and simple. Now after eating, you'd begin your day's work. Most peasants lived on manorial estates under the authority of a lord who owned their land. Families were tied to the soil generation after generation. The work was relentless, bound to the rhythm of the seasons, and almost entirely physical. Men, women, and children alike labored in the fields, often from sunrise to sunset, planting, weeding, harvesting, or tending livestock. A modern person might last a few hours of this work before muscles gave out or blisters formed. Imagine stooping to pull weeds for hours or hauling water from a well dozens of times a day. That was life, and there was no option of going home early to rest on the couch. There was no couch at all, only rough benches and straw pallets to sit or lay upon once the labor was mercifully done. Clothing would not offer much comfort either. Forget soft cotton t-shirts or tailored jeans. Medieval peasants wore rough linen undergarments and coarse wool tunics or dresses. Imagine wool in summer heat, itchy and unwashed for long periods of time. Footwear was basic leather, often patched or falling apart. Cleaning outfits was not easy since laundry meant hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing with lye, and drying garments in the sun. Most people owned just one or two sets of clothing to rotate. Bathing was rare too, sometimes only a handful of times in an entire year. So the itchiness and dirtiness of daily life quickly added up. Just surviving one day in such clothing would be humbling. Medical reality in medieval times was another matter that might break modern endurance quickly. Small wounds could become infected easily, and something as common as a toothache could spiral into life-threatening infection without modern medicine. Hospitals existed, but were not what we might call hospitals. They were often run by monasteries and focused more on prayer than on scientific cures. Bloodletting was a favoured treatment. Imagine a medieval barber surgeon deciding that your fever meant he should open your veins to let the bad humours out. The very thought is enough to make us grateful for modern medicine. A single migraine or stomach bug could become miserable beyond tolerance without proper remedies. And the absence of modern comforts like aspirin or cozy blankets would make even a short illness unbearable. Yet cities and towns held even greater challenges. If you wandered into a medieval city, the streets would be narrow, muddy, and noisy. Pigs and dogs ran freely. Markets clattered with merchants hawking fish, cloth, and spices, and beggars lined the squares. Disease spread rapidly in such close quarters, with outbreaks of plague, a recurring terror. The infamous Black Death of the 14th century wiped out perhaps half of Europe's population. Imagine living one day in such constant fear, when merely brushing shoulders with someone could feel fatal. The stress of existing with that shadow overhead would weigh on the mind like a heavy stone. Even the food for those living in towns was tough on modern palates. Bread was a staple, but often coarse, mixed with ground beans or peas to stretch the wheat. Meat was a rarity for poor families, perhaps a salted bit of pork only on feast days. Fish and broth were more common, though without refrigeration, preservation meant salting or smoking meat into rubbery toughness. Fruits or vegetables were seasonal, and hunger was always near. Malnutrition was widespread, leading to stunted growth and frailty. Just imagine spending one day without the abundance of snacks, coffee shops, or supermarkets that we casually browse through now. If for a moment you've thought, perhaps nobility had it easier, let's step into a castle for contrast. Yes, the wealthy lords and ladies had softer clothes, spiced food, and feather beds, though even castle life came with its discomforts. Castles were cold, draughty stone fortresses where smoke from hearths filled the chambers, and windows were merely narrow slits, letting in light, but very little warmth. Hygiene in castles was not much better. Chamber pots were emptied into courtyards or moats, and fleas and lice thrived. Meals were more lavish, with roasted meat and sugared confections, but digestion was still a hazardous matter, as food safety knowledge did not exist. Wealthy households also practiced intense formality with rituals, strict etiquette, and constant political maneuvering. You might sit at table but be judged for how you held your spoon, or risk offending someone with the wrong gesture. For many modern visitors, the stress of this frozen politeness could be as unbearable as the cold, draft-laden halls themselves. Entertainment in medieval times might sustain you for a little while, though only modestly. In villages, there were holiday festivals, dancing, drinking, and games like dice or skittles. But these marked exceptions in an otherwise grinding routine. And in towns, troubadours might recite songs of romance and chivalry, and jesters might juggle and joke in noble halls. Yet again, imagine watching the same entertainments repeated endlessly, with no cinema, no streaming, no novels for the masses. Even literacy was uncommon. Books were precious, handwritten by monks, and the average person never owned one. A modern guest who grew tired of fieldwork or hard bread could not even escape into a light novel. That outlet simply did not exist. The world was dangerous too, not only because of disease. Justice was brutal by modern standards. Thieves could be whipped, branded, mutilated, or hanged. Wars between rival lords could turn villages into battlegrounds overnight. Foreign invaders, marauders, or raiding knights might devastate an entire countryside without warning. For peasants, the habit of leaving home and arriving back alive was by no means guaranteed. The church offered spiritual comfort, but sometimes demanded harsh penance on top of life's existing hardships. Each day brought its risks, and surviving one day without injury, punishment, or loss was already a victory. Imagine lasting in such tension when our own nerves are tested by things as minor as traffic. And so, as we start this slow walk through medieval life, notice how each minor detail taken together forms a portrait of a world nearly impossible for us to endure. The smells, the hunger, the cold, the violence, the rituals, the illnesses, they all weave themselves into existence. To last one day in medieval times would mean reshaping every expectation of comfort that we have, replacing it instead with grit, acceptance, and often with resignation. We have only just opened the gates in this journey, and there is so much more to see across other corners of history. But for now, we will linger here at the threshold of the medieval world, taking it step by step softly, until your eyelids weigh heavy and the scenes fade into dreams. As we continue walking through this medieval world, it's worth pausing to reflect on how different the sense of time itself was compared to our modern lives. Today, we measure our hours with clocks on our wrists, alarms on our phones, carefully scheduled appointments, and routines carved into minutes. But in the 14th century, time was often measured by the rising sun, the chiming of church bells, or the labor of the seasons. A village might know noon because the priest rang the bell for mass, or because a shadow on a crude sundial had crept to its mark. But precise timekeeping was not part of everyday life. Very few people had access to mechanical clocks, which had only just begun to appear in major cathedrals. So, life moved not by the measured beat of seconds, but by rooster calls in the morning, the position of the sun overhead, or the coming chill of dusk. For us, a single day without a clock might feel liberating at first, but quickly disorienting. Imagine not knowing when exactly to eat, when exactly to stop, because the only schedule binding you was the endless, demanding rhythm of nature. This natural time meant that work was relentless, but punctuated by festivals tied to the church calendar. Saints' days, holy feasts, and harvest celebrations offered some respite, though at the same time, the church governed many aspects of life. Almost everything was filtered through a spiritual lens. Sins were tracked carefully, penances assigned, indulgences granted. The fear of purgatory or damnation was a constant companion. For peasants, this fear was so ingrained that even ordinary misfortune, a spoiled harvest, or an unexpected illness, was seen as divine punishment or as the work of malevolent forces like witches or demons. It created a world where faith and fear were intertwined, binding people together in rituals, masses, and prayers, but also keeping them in awe of every flicker of candlelight in a church nave and every toll of the funeral bell in the night. To live one day under such immense spiritual weight would exhaust not only our bodies but our minds, pulling us into a reality where unseen forces governed every outcome. Now imagine the physical structures that surrounded this society. Most medieval villages were clusters of timber and wattle houses, with thatched roofs that invited sparks from the hearth to ignite them at any moment. Fires were a constant threat. Floors were often hard earth, perhaps strewn with rushes, long grasses meant to soften the ground. Those rushes became quickly dirty, filled with scraps of food, animal waste carried in on boots, and all manner of tiny crawling things. Replacing them was done irregularly, so for most of the year, households lived with dirt piled underfoot. A modern person might scarcely last an hour before longing for a broom, a mop, or a vacuum cleaner, all luxuries yet to be dreamed of. In castles, the situation was only somewhat improved. As smoke blackened the walls, damp chilled the stones, and rodents skittered freely across high rafters and storerooms. Sanitation, or the lack of it, affected health enormously. Water sources were often contaminated. Wells sometimes sat just downhill from cesspits. One may think of the modern warnings about drinking tap water in some places today. But in medieval villages, nearly all water was suspect. It's no wonder ale and weak beer were consumed daily. They were blessings compared to the sicknesses that festered in stagnant pools and shallow ditches. Diseases flourished in such conditions. Typhoid, dysentery, smallpox, and constant fevers plagued communities. For children especially, survival was uncertain. Nearly 1 out of every 3 might not live past the age of 5. To step into such a world, even for one imaginary day, would be to step into a realm where death lurked silently at the edge of every cough, every chill, every warm flush of fever. Life for women in medieval times amplified these difficulties even further. While women contributed enormously through work in fields, homes, and markets, their social and legal status remained bound to male authority, fathers, husbands, or lords who controlled most decisions. The risks of childbirth were terrifyingly high. Without sterile instruments or advanced knowledge, even a healthy young woman faced life-threatening danger each time she went into labor. Midwives relied on practices handed down by tradition, herbs, and prayers. Childbirth became a spiritual as well as physical ordeal, with women invoking saints for safe passage as often as they relied on skilled hands. Imagine being a modern woman surrounded by such uncertainty, knowing even one birth could bring darkness instead of joy. Surviving one day in that uncertainty would strain any sense of calm. At the same time, the structure of medieval villages and towns created a closeness, sometimes comforting, sometimes suffocating. Neighbors all knew one another. Privacy in the modern sense hardly existed, as doors were open, walls were thin, and rumors spread faster than wildfire. Everyone knew who skipped mass, who argued with a spouse, who drank too heavily, who sang bawdy songs after dusk. For some, this community was the fabric of life, ensuring help when harvests failed or in times of sickness. For others, it was a constant reminder of judgment and watchfulness, like living permanently in a glass house. How many of us, who treasure solitude and private space, would manage in such a world where every action, every misstep, was visible to a crowd of watching eyes? And while we may imagine the medieval world as locked in rustic labour, the looming presence of knights and lords shaped daily security. The lord of the manor demanded rents, tithes, and a share of harvests. He provided protection, at least that was the promise. But peasants often bore the brunt of war when rival lords clashed. Knights, armoured and mounted, seemed larger than life, but their glittering presence came at a cost. Armour needed funding, castles required taxes, and campaigns pulled men from ploughs into battlefields. For the simple villager, the knight was not a romantic hero, but an agent of power, taking as much as he gave. To live one day under such authority meant knowing your labour fed not only your family, but also the endless ambitions of those in stone keeps above you. Meals punctuated this harshness, but even they reveal how differently life was structured. A midday meal might be the largest. Thick bread trenchers serving as plates, vegetables boiled until soft, beans or peas forming the base, perhaps spiced with a bit of bacon fat if fortune allowed. Meals were eaten with fingers, sometimes with a knife, but forks scarcely existed. Conversation could be merry, yet etiquette was stern, especially for those dining under noble eyes. Rules governed where you sat, how you ate, what you were permitted to say. To modern diners accustomed to comfort food savoured in quiet kitchens, a medieval meal might feel crowded, messy, smoky, and hierarchical, an experience not easily endured with a smile. And when the day finally ended, what awaited you? A night not relieved by electric light or the glowing comfort of a screen, but true darkness. Candles were expensive, so peasants relied on dim oil lamps or simple torches, which gave little light and much smoke. Nighttime was when fears deepened. Wolves in the forests, bandits on the roads, restless spirits in folklore wandering by moonlight. Families gathered early to bed, not on mattresses but on straw, sometimes whole families together in one room to share warmth. If you were lucky, woolen blankets layered over you, otherwise cold lingered heavily. The sounds of snoring, coughing, livestock bleating outside, and the ever-present smell of smoke and sweat filled the space. It was not restful by modern standards, more survival than comfort. Would you, accustomed to soft beds and glowing lamps, last a single night of this? It is doubtful, yet for millions of medieval people, this was every night of their lives. So, while our first glimpse showed us the daily labour of the medieval peasant, this deeper step into their rhythms shows how completely alien the world was. Not just the labour, but the sense of time, the closeness of neighbours, the watchfulness of the church, the constant hazards of cleanliness, or the lack of it, all pressed against one's existence in ways nearly unbearable by modern measure. These weren't occasional burdens, but the daily structure of life itself, unavoidable as sunrise. And yet, amid all this, they endured, generation after generation, shaping the fabric out of which modern Europe would one day emerge. As you breathe slowly and allow the weight of this history to settle, imagine how even a single 24 hours under such demands would stretch and strain you. The marvel is not that you wouldn't last a day in medieval times, but that so many millions did, so many times over. If you've managed to survive that long medieval day, the next dawn brings us closer to the machinery of society that made it all possible, or at least tolerable. Beyond the fields and kitchens were the intricate systems of law, obligation, and custom that stitched medieval life together like the seams of a coarse wool tunic. Modern life is wrapped in concepts of individual rights, consumer choices, and a sense of freedom to move as we please. In the Middle Ages, those ideas would have been as alien as a glowing screen or a motor car. Life was duty first, self later, or not at all. Every person's place was set in a social hierarchy known as the Great Chain of Being, a concept that arose not only from secular order, but also from the theology preached in pulpits. You were born not just into a family, but into a rank in the cosmic order, lords above knights above peasants, peasants above livestock, or so the reasoning went. To step out or resist was to defy both society and heaven. Serfs, who formed the majority of the population, were bound to their lord's estate. They couldn't simply pack their belongings and move to Paris or London to try their luck. To leave without permission was considered essentially theft, robbing the lord of labour. Think about how strange this feels to us, who can relocate towns, states, or even countries with enough effort. One day, under rules that stipulate your entire existence is tied to a specific field, a specific set of animals, and a specific tax obligation, would chafe against every modern instinct toward autonomy. Yet such obligations, no matter how constraining, were the glue that held medieval society together. The obligations paid upward: tithes to the parish church, rents to the lord, feudal dues for protection. For the peasant, this could mean handing over part of your harvest or animals just after you pulled them from soil or shed. Imagine the fatigue of completing backbreaking harvest work only to see a chunk of it carted away. Still, refusal was not an option. Rebellion could mean brutal punishment. Yet for lords and knights, obligations also flowed upward to their kings. Knights owed military service to their lords, who owed men and resources to the crown. Feudalism, as historians name it, was a web of mutual obligation, though in reality, the higher ranks benefited most, and those at the bottom bore the weight. It is said modern bureaucracy can sometimes grind the individual into dust. The medieval version was less paperwork but equally crushing. Even justice itself was an ordeal. Quite literally in some cases. Trials could be decided by carrying hot iron to see if wounds healed cleanly, or by plunging one's arm into boiling water and waiting for divine judgment. Combat was another grim standard. Let two men fight, and God would grant victory to the righteous. This was not order in the court, as we know it, but a theatre of faith and violence. Losing meant not only losing freedom, but often life or limb. For common disputes, the punishments were swift and public. A thief might lose a hand. A liar might endure time in the stocks, while villagers hurled insults, or worse, at him. The very heart of justice was not fairness in the modern sense, but deterrence, spectacle, and a reliance on divine oversight. One can imagine how an honest mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time could spiral into a nightmare from which there was no escape. To modern sensibilities, living even one day under such arbitrary, brutal justice would feel unbearable. Now, not everyone in the medieval world toiled in muddy fields or knelt before lords. Towns and cities, though smaller than we imagine them, were vital hubs of trade and craft. Picture a medieval marketplace, canopies flapping, voices shouting over one another in a dozen dialects, the sense of fresh bread clashing with drying hides, raw fish, and piles of unwashed bodies. Guilds controlled the trades. If you wanted to be a blacksmith, a baker, or a weaver, you entered an apprenticeship. From boyhood, sometimes beginning at age 7, you lived with a master craftsman, worked long days, and endured strict discipline. Years later, if fortune favored you, you might become a journeyman, traveling from town to town. And only after still more years of proving your skill and saving money might you become a master with your own shop sign proudly displayed. For a modern worker used to job switching, remote work, or career change, the rigidity and decades-long apprenticeship would test patience to the breaking point. And yet, in marketplaces shimmered glimpses of richness, spices like cinnamon and pepper arriving from distant lands, bolts of dyed cloth more vibrant than anything produced in local homes, strange medical concoctions that promised cures, and trinkets that seemed magical. A town fair offered a rare taste of festivity, musicians teaching folk songs, jugglers tossing knives in church squares, even mock tournaments with boyish squires strutting playfully. Yet the very gathering of so many strangers also meant pickpockets weaving silently through crowds, disease festering with every handshake, and guards watchful for revolt. Excitement rode hand in hand with danger. Is it any wonder that modern people might find such an environment exhilarating for an hour, but exhausting after a day? Religion underpinned all of it. The town square dominated by the church tower, its bells dictating not only time but mood. Mornings marked by matins, noontimes by Angelus prayers, and evenings by vespers. The sound was ceaseless, a reminder of God's watchful presence. The very week shaped itself around holy days, fasts, and festivals. On Fridays, meat gave way to fish. Lent meant sombre austerity, Easter brought pageantry. Life was not lived as secular. Weaving faith into every activity was non-negotiable. Architecture soared to reinforce this. Even the poorest villages built churches striving for grandeur. While great cathedrals took centuries to rise, each stone lifted as a labour of devotion. A modern visitor accustomed to separating religion from daily routine might struggle to last a day under such constant enveloping authority. Refusing to join might not be seen as private choice, but as dangerous heresy. What about children? Those symbols of hope and continuity. Childhood, as we know it, was brief. From perhaps the age of 7, children began working, herding geese, fetching water, running errands, or apprenticing to masters. Formal schooling was reserved for the few. sons of wealthy families or those bound for monasteries. Even then, it meant endless hours chanting Latin psalms or copying texts by candlelight. For most children, play existed on the margins, rough games in fields, pretend jousts with sticks, or songs sung while weaving baskets. They were smaller workers in a large machine, not shielded dreamers. Imagine our own teenagers lugging firewood daily before dawn. For us, impossible. Yet for medieval families, the only way the household survived. A child of today would protest after an hour, then collapse under fatigue. By nightfall, as you prepared to slip back onto that straw-stuffed pallet, you might look up to rafters and see drying garlic hung as charms, wooden symbols of saints, or crude talismans against evil eyes. The medieval world was full of superstition threaded seamlessly into daily life. Every shadow could hide a spirit, every illness a curse, every inexplicable event the hand of Providence or the devil. To live one day under such mental pressure, submitting every unexplained sneeze or broken pot to cosmic interpretations, would breed both anxiety and awe in equal measure. Yet this was not considered paranoia but common sense. Anxiety was soothed not by science but by charms, pilgrimages, and the whispered blessings of a priest. All told, by the end of such a day, your feet sore, your stomach unsatisfied, your mind weighed down by custom, obligation, and fear. You might already wonder how anyone lasted a lifetime in such conditions, and yet they did. They laughed, sang, married, celebrated. They shaped stories of dragons and knights to give meaning to their lives. But could you, or I, endure even just one stretch of hours without familiar comforts? Likely not. Yet one can't help admiring the resilience of those who did, day after day, unshielded from the grind and the uncertainty, living lives that were brutal, but undeniably real. As dawn breaks again over our imagined medieval day, the crow of a rooster summons you not gently, but commanding, telling you it's time to rise and take your place once more in this unforgiving world. The morning light filters in faintly through a small wooden shutter, not glass, because glass windows were luxuries reserved for the wealthy. You awaken stiff, perhaps sore from the rough bedding, and immediately you're greeted by the chill of stone or dirt floors beneath your feet. Imagine rising without the instant warmth of modern heating, with no blanket of central radiators silently doing their work. Instead, the embers of last night's hearth smolder faintly, and reviving the fire becomes your first task. Without it, there would be no warmth, no cooking, and little light to push back the gloom. The kitchen, if it can be called that, is no tiled room with counters and cupboards. It is a space around the fire, an iron cauldron hanging over flames, wooden bowls stacked roughly, and some bread set aside from yesterday. Villagers depended constantly on bread, the staff of life, but danger lurked even here. Grain stores, if gone damp, could grow mold that produced a toxin called ergot. In small amounts, it made people ill, with cramps, hallucinations, and tremors. In large doses, it could kill. Entire communities sometimes fell under the grip of St. Anthony's fire, writhing in agony, their limbs blackened as ergot poisoning coursed through them. Imagine sitting down to your one sure meal and discovering it might accidentally poison you, all because curing grain was at the mercy of weather. Food was never guaranteed to nourish. Sometimes, it carried hidden risks crueler than hunger itself. If you survived your breakfast, perhaps you traveled down to the communal fields. Work was always communal because no single family could cultivate all their own strips without help. Fields in medieval villages were divided into long, thin strips scattered across open fields. Each peasant family had rights to farm a number of these, but never in one neat plot. This arrangement forced families to labor side by side, each wielding wooden plows or mattocks, oxen pulling arduously through heavy earth. The soil smelled rich, damp, and familiar to those who grew up with it, but for unaccustomed hands. A single morning pulling weeds or carrying sacks of earth would quickly shred muscles unused to such endless strain. Even noble families, though not performing the hard tasks themselves, had their wealth pulled from the sweat of these toil-worn peasants. And while villages hummed with this rhythm, above them loomed the towering reminder of power, the castle. Imagine a castle perched on a distant hill, grey battlements clawing skyward. Its silhouette looked like protection, but to peasants, it was often a reminder of authority more than sanctuary. Inside, carved wooden chairs draped in tapestries lined smoky halls. Servants bustled, preparing bread, cheese, and salted meat for the lord. A lord's day might involve presiding over disputes, collecting rents, or hosting a messenger travelling from another noble house. At moments, it involved leisure, a hawking hunt, a game of chess, rehearsals for a feast. Yet even for nobles, medieval life was laden with anxiety. Politics were sharp-edged tools, and a single wrong alliance could unravel a dynasty. Peasants feared crime, nobles feared betrayal. At every tier, daily existence throbbed with danger, though in different guises. And then there was war. You might imagine wars were constant battles between armoured knights clashing gloriously. In truth, skirmishes often meant raids. Swift parties of armed men swarming a village, torching roofs, claiming livestock, dragging captives. For peasants, this was not a noble display of courage, but sudden devastation. Roads were dangerous, often empty stretches of wilderness prowled by bandits. Merchants travelling with goods often moved in caravan for safety, and knights gathered in armed patrols. Unlike today, when travel is felt mostly as inconvenience of long lines or delayed flights, even a trip to the next market town could be life-threatening. One day spent journeying along medieval roads might be enough to make a modern traveller scurry back to the imagined safety of motorways. If fortune spared you from thieves or soldiers that day, you might find yourself at church, the anchor of your community. Step into its dim interior and smell the mix of incense and wax. Candles sputter, illuminating carved saints gazing serenely from alcoves, their paint worn by centuries of devotion. This was the largest building in the village, built in solid stone when most homes were wood. For villagers, the church was stability, authority, and guidance. Everyone gathered here on Sundays, men and women separated by custom, all kneeling on cold stone floors during long masses spoken in Latin, a tongue few understood. Imagine listening hour after hour to words you could not comprehend, murmuring prayers you memorized, and entrusting your fate to mysteries forever half-shrouded. For us, used to explanations and summaries at our fingertips, that veil of unknowability would feel unbearable after a single sermon. Superstition bound itself to daily acts too. When crops faltered, whispers might fall onto a widow living apart, a woman perhaps known for collecting herbs. Suspicion of witchcraft often grew from such times of strain. To be labelled a witch could be fatal, as fear led to trials where no defence sufficed against rumour and panic. Imagine one day in a society where suspicion alone could doom you, where every glance at a neighbour risked misinterpretation. It was not merely external hardship, but constant unease that marked the medieval landscape. As the day wanes, supper is prepared, but calling it supper summons grander images than reality. Often it was more of the same porridge or bread, perhaps cabbage or onions boiled together, maybe cheese if luck held. Meat remained scarce, though fishing offered occasional relief. And when festivals came, harvest feasts, Yuletide, Easter, they burst briefly with roasted geese, ale flowing freely, pastries filled with honey. But these were exceptions, remembered long afterward, not everyday fare. Day-to-day food was at best utilitarian, fuel for labour, and never the wide, colourful array we expect now. Even the simpleness of a ripe apple in winter was denied, for seasons ruled all, and then comes darkness again. Shadows swallow corners, flames flicker from the hearth, offering warmth to those pressed closely around. For comfort or for fear, most families slept in groups, parents, children, sometimes even servants or animals. The body heat was necessary, and the closeness practical. Privacy existed less than the space between breaths. Here, whispered prayers or stories marked the settling hours. Tales of saints, heroes, or strange beasts prowling the nearby woods. These stories guided children into restless dreams and reminded adults of the mysteries beyond their knowing. One more day ends, and you, intruder from the present, feel the weight crushing harder. It is not just the work or the hunger. It is the omnipresence of danger, the lack of choice, the inescapability of communal life watched by lords above and God above them all. Even in your imagination, your bones ache, your throat longs for pure water, your skin itches beneath wool, and your eyes crave lamplight that will never come. How long, really, could you last here? Could you endure again tomorrow, with all its sameness and all its danger? The answer comes quietly, like the wind rustling through thatched roof. For us, perhaps not even a single day. As the rooster calls again and the pale dawn creeps into the room, life resumes in the medieval village much as before, predictable, relentless, and exhausting. By now, if you have somehow survived our imagined days here, you'd probably be aching in body and mind. But let's push forward, because surviving in medieval times wasn't just about food in your belly or straw under your back. It was about being woven into the intricate tapestry of obligation, fear, tradition, and, occasionally, moments of wonder. One of the most jarring parts of another medieval morning would be how quickly you were expected to return to usefulness. There was no concept of sleeping in, no leisurely cup of coffee to start the day, no space carved out for me time. The rhythm of life was directed almost entirely outward, to the land, the family, the village, and the church. A boy of 10 might already be helping guide oxen or carrying water from the well. A girl the same age tending younger siblings, spinning thread, or assisting in food preparation. There was no adolescence as we know it. Childhood was short, suddenly swallowed up by adult responsibility. To us, who often think of childhood as a protected sanctuary, the expectation of full labor at such an age feels shocking. Yet to them, it wasn't cruelty. It was survival. The wider world beyond the village was full of hazards, but it also pulsed with energy and change. Trade routes tied even small communities into broad networks. A merchant traveling through with bolts of dyed silk or jars of exotic spice was a reminder that distant lands existed, shimmering with strange promise. For villagers, such goods were mostly unattainable, save for a whiff of cinnamon in a lord's feast, or stories of caravans stretching to the east. And yet the knowledge that the world was bigger than the cluster of cottages offered its own fragile comfort. To a modern person accidentally dropped into this setting, these wandering merchants might be the only familiar comfort, the sense that elsewhere existed, though unreachable. Of course, the church remained a constant companion, and one cannot step through even a single medieval day without encountering its presence. Priests tracked life stages carefully: baptism, marriage, confession, last rites. It was both spiritual compass and social regulator. If you missed Mass, your absence did not go unnoticed. If you jested about sacred things, whispers could circle against you. The church calendar itself dictated labor and pause. Even feasts served as reinforcements of order. The sense of being watched, invisible but unceasing, might drive a modern mind to unease after a single day. Imagine each thought, each little rebellion of fancy, shadowed by reminders of sin and penance. This constant inner policing would be a heavy companion for anyone used to more liberal thought. And yet, within ecclesiastical dominance, moments of beauty also flourished. A wander through a cathedral town, for example, could feel otherworldly. Sunlight streaming through stained glass windows splashed colours across stone floors, while choirs chanted harmonics that seemed to lift the soul beyond this world. It's easy to imagine standing there, weary and aching from the harshness of daily work, and suddenly being overwhelmed by the transcendent. It was this capacity for wonder, the play of light, the sonorous chant, that balanced the burden of fear. Without such reminders, life might have been unbearable. For a modern stranger in this world, one day inside such a cathedral might be the only part of the experience that eased the heart instead of weighing it down. The realities of medicine, however, would drag you swiftly back toward dread. Picture the smallest cut on your hands swelling with infection. Without antiseptics, without knowledge of microbes, the treatment might involve applying poultices of herbs, or worse, cauterizing with hot metal. Broken bones meant crude splints, head injuries meant prayers. Sickness spread easily through villages, carried on fleas, spoiled water, or unwashed hands. Coughs lingered, fevers debilitated, and childbirth dangers loomed tragically. Monks preserved some fragments of classical medical texts, but often viewed ailments as trials from God. Patients were prescribed not only herbs, but confessions, prayers, or pilgrimages. One day navigating illness here would reduce the strongest spirit to trembling fear. For us who can find comfort in a bottle of pain relievers or antibiotics within reach, the sheer vulnerability of medieval life feels unbearable. As we walk through another imagined afternoon, villages appear deceptively bucolic, children chasing geese near the pond, a dog barking at the boundary wall, wood smoke rising in steady trails. And yet beneath the calm surface, tensions roiled. Grain shortages, poor weather, or an unlucky fire could wreck survival for months. A noble's levy might strip peasants of harvest shares just when food was thinnest. In such moments, the fragile fabric frayed. Villagers sometimes resisted. There were scattered local uprisings, men rallying with pitchforks and scythes against manor lords. Yet uprisings were almost always crushed with ferocity, teaching survivors to tread carefully. To live just a single day under the shadow of knowing rebellion could end in ruin would bend the will into caution. It's easy to see how submission, however begrudging, seemed the safest path most days. Meanwhile, noble families lived differently but under no less strain. Their lives appeared more opulent, draped in fine fabrics and lined with minstrel songs. But a noble day was riddled with obligations, managing retainers, hearing disputes, exacting rents, or planning defensive strategy against rival lords. Marriages were calculated to build alliances, not chosen lightly out of affection. Sons were trained as knights from youth, sent to other households to serve and learn. Daughters were groomed for politically expedient marriages, their fates sealed sometimes before they could speak full sentences. Castle walls offered safety but also isolation. Drafts whistled through corridors, smoke filled kitchens, and tension simmered always. Laughter echoed in feast halls. Yes, but behind jeweled goblets lay constant intrigue. A stranger from our world, perhaps dazzled at first, might quickly wilt under the pressure of endless performance, etiquette, and looming suspicion. And then there were the spectacles that bound communities together. Tournaments, feast days, travelling fairs. The excitement of a joust, knights thundering toward each other in glittering armour, the crowd roaring with awe, seemed to offer a vision of glory. Yet these tournaments were dangerous and bloody, and the prestige they conveyed often meant more risk than reward. Meanwhile, for peasants watching, it was both entertainment and reminder. The martial might of the nobility towered over them, untouchable. For one day's visitor from our world, the spectacle might first thrill but later dismay, knowing behind the shimmering armour lay broken bones, shattered teeth, and sometimes death, all for mock battles staged to entertain and impress. And when evening arrives once more, the cycle resumes, families huddled close, fatigue pressing down, and ordinary survival continuing as if endlessly. Darkness wasn't merely absence of light, it was opportunity for fears to prowl. Fires banked low, prayers whispered again, charms hung against spirits, owls called from rafters, wolves howled in distant forests, and villagers wrapped themselves even tighter. That dense, uneasy night would weigh upon a modern soul unaccustomed to the true depth of darkness or to the undercurrent of imagined spirits that haunted every forgotten sound. One full day more is survived, but always it feels like only just. The people of the Middle Ages endured this cycle without reprieve, not for days, but for decades. And while we peer into their world for a single imagined stretch of hours, marveling at their resilience and wondering at their customs, we also recognize the truth. Despite the hardships, cruelties and fears, these men and women carried the world forward. They sang while threshing wheat. They told stories by low firelight. They carved saints into wood and dreamed of the fields beyond death. But could we last in their place for even one day? More and more, it seems unlikely. Yet their survival makes our fleeting discomforts appear small. And it is in that realization where their endurance truly humbles us. As the cycle rolls on to yet another imagined medieval sunrise, it becomes clear that survival in this world wasn't only about hard labor or avoiding illness. It was also about carrying the constant weight of politics, hierarchy, and the unpredictable turn of fortune. Each day required more than muscles and bread. It demanded adaptability to rapidly shifting dangers from both above and below. To last even one more dawn here, you'd have to navigate a society that thrived on rigid order, yet constantly teetered on chaos. You wake again in the village, straw sticking to your hair, back aching from the crooked wooden beams overhead. Today begins as any other, but whispers ripple through the community. A tax collector from the Lord is expected to arrive. This means households frantically gathering portions of grain, chickens, or coins if they have them. For peasants, taxes were not abstract figures but tangible slices of their labor. Baskets of barley carried to the manor, a cherished goat taken away, butter measured carefully. Failure to provide could mean punishment or public humiliation. Taxes weren't filed online once a year. They intruded directly into daily life. Imagine one day when your pantry is rifled through by an official to ensure you've given enough to satisfy your overlord. The anxiety of waiting for that knock at the door would sour the whole morning, making even breath feel heavier. Meanwhile, as you glance down the roadway, you might see soldiers, retainers of the Lord, clad in mail, swords glinting. They are intimidating, not just for their gear, but for their authority. The presence of armed men in any village stirred both relief and unease. Relief, because they might deter bandits or raiders. Unease, because soldiers carried power to take in-kind payments, food, ale, or quartering in homes whether peasants liked it or not. For us, accustomed to police bound by rules, the unchecked presence of armed men demanding hospitality or supplies would feel overwhelming after just one visit. But overhead, in the tapestry of the realm, politics churned with even harsher edges. Kings struggled against nobles, nobles plotted against one another. Alliances were stitched and torn apart as swiftly as fabric in shears. Wars, succession disputes, or papal decrees could suddenly reshape the fate of entire communities. A royal feud dozens of miles away might spill down suddenly into local misery. New taxes, press gangs recruiting young men, or lords fortifying castles while peasants provided both stone and sweat. Imagine losing a day's work because someone far removed in a distant court argued over disputed crowns. The effect for common people was rarely grandeur, just heavier labour and emptier bowls. And yet, amid this unrelenting burden, the medieval world cultivated a strange sort of resilience. In town squares, entertainers busked with bawdy songs or tales of Arthurian romance. Jesters poked fun at nobles under the safety of their official license to jest, and folk stories sprouted exaggerated monsters to explain the unknowable wilderness beyond. Humour, story, and song weren't luxuries, they were medicines of the spirit. For one day, laughing at a puppet play or a wandering mime could be the only escape one's mind permitted from worry. Still, the humour was often crude by modern standards, sharpened by hunger and shaped by hardship. The jokes that once lightened peasants' hearts might sound grim to us. Could we laugh even for a moment in a world so heavy? Perhaps, but it would take effort, the kind that tired minds would scarcely find after dusk. And then there were the tournaments and executions, spectacles of a different kind. For townsfolk, these events were both entertainment and warnings. Watching knights joust was thrilling for some, terrifying for others. Clashes carrying noise, blood, and broken bodies. Executions were presented openly, a deterrent displayed theatrically. To us, accustomed to concealing violent justice away from public courtyards, seeing a hanging or a beheading broadcast as afternoon activity would be deeply unsettling. Yet to medieval dwellers it was ordinary. For many, justice wasn't complete unless it was watched and remembered. Enduring just one day that ended with such a spectacle might be enough to shake even the hardiest among us. Inside homes too, the weight remained constant. After work came household management, spinning wool and flax, repairing tools, drying herbs for remedies and food. Women bore immense responsibilities here, sustaining not only family survival, but also trade. A single snapped thread on the loom, a burnt batch of bread or broken jar of salt could bring both ridicule and disaster. There were no corner shops to restock casually. Each mistake carried real consequence. Picture yourself fumbling in such a moment, breaking a jar of the household's only honey. That accident would mean not an apology followed by a replacement, but days or weeks of longing for sweetness suddenly gone. The fragility of resources made even minor slips feel monumental. We who live in a world of endless convenience would quickly tumble into despair after one such blunder. In the villages, the rhythm of communal life had its seasonal crescendos. Feast days lit fires of joy, maypoles towering in spring, midsummer bonfires casting long shadows on laughing dancers, harvest feasts rich with mead, roasted meats, and songs merry and wild. These occasions were the bright punctuation against otherwise grueling years, but they came rarely, and when they faded, reality returned with force. You'd go to bed on the night of dancing and singing, then wake to aching heads, sore feet, and the return of drudgery. The short-lived bursts of celebration masked an otherwise bleak constancy. Could you cling to that merriment to survive through the rest of the year? Perhaps, if your heart was trained by necessity to savor brief joys and stretch them across long months. At dusk, the village might gather in tight circle to hear tales told. Wolves prowling the woods, saints performing miracles, or travelers returning with impossible stories of lands across the sea. The firelight would catch faces wide-eyed, weary but animated. To us, used to endless screens and entertainment, this might sound charming at first. But remember, without any diversions beyond song, story, and occasional fare, nightly entertainment could feel suffocatingly meager. After a week, a month, an entire lifetime, the monotony of hearing variations on the same legends every night would fray the attention of a modern soul who expects endless newness. As the village prepares to sleep, the weight of social order presses again. Curfews set in some towns, watchmen patrolling dark alleys, howls echoing from distant woods. You press close to family for warmth, enduring straws scratch, coughs in the dark, and gnawing hunger that never quite fades. And there you realize something profound. To last even one day here requires more than physical stamina. It requires surrender, to accept things as unchangeable, to embrace tiny joys while suppressing constant dread, to survive quietly both in body and spirit. That's the art medieval people mastered, something alien to us, who live in expectation of change, control, and comfort. With yet another day closing, you might finally admit, you and I, accidental travelers into this world, might survive, barely, a single cycle of light and dark. But the price of that survival would be crushing. Humility, hunger, pain, and fear, unlike anything we take for granted today. And still, the people of that age endured. Not just endured, but built cathedrals, carved songs into memory, raised children who laughed under the same sun. The marvel is not that we could not last a day, but that they somehow lasted a lifetime. The next dawn feels heavier, not because the sun has changed, but because, by now, the weight of medieval life has surely settled into your bones. You rise stiff and weary, the same scratchy wool on your skin, the same dirt clinging beneath your fingernails, the same endless repetition of routine stretching yawningly in front of you. Familiarity is supposed to comfort, but in this world it often brings despair, for it reminds you that each day differs little from the one before. To live even one more medieval day is to be pressed down by monotony as much as hardship. But monotony had its own peculiar breaks. For example, let us imagine today is a market day. Villagers trudge down a muddy path, baskets in hand, bundles of onions, cheeses wrapped in cloth, maybe even chickens squawking reluctantly underarm. The market is chaos to modern eyes. Animals bleating, hawkers shouting, the smells of fish, leather, fried cakes sizzling in pans, and more than a little whiff of waste from open gutters. There are rarely set prices as we know them. Haggling is expected, and coinage, when available, is a jumble of local mintings, foreign silver, and clipped pennies, each scrutinized for weight and authenticity. A modern shopper might last all of 10 minutes before despairing over the confusion, the noise, and the sheer disorder of it all. Yet for medieval peasants, this was both necessity and special occasion, a chance to trade, gossip, and glimpse distant travelers. Markets also brought entertainments. Performers juggled. Storytellers recited romances of knights and maidens. Wandering musicians carried lutes or fiddles, filling the air with tune. For us, these amusements might seem quaint, but to those with no theatre, no books, no portable music, this was like magic. A story about King Arthur battling giants might be repeated 100 times and still draw hushed silence from the crowd, because the scarcity of story made each telling precious. Children wide-eyed at a trick with cups or a puppet show felt the same thrill as a child might feel today at a cinema. For a visitor from our age, the novelty could enchant for an afternoon, but soon you would long for your endless library of modern diversions. By evening, the novelty would fade into restless frustration, reminding you how much you rely on abundance of choice. But markets also bore danger. Crowds were fertile ground for disease, especially lice and fleas hopping merrily from host to host. Pickpockets prowled too, cutting straps and slipping into purses. Violence could erupt if a drunken brawl spread like sparks in dry straw. And the ever-watchful presence of the Lord's officials hovered over the chaos. Inspectors checking bread weights, ensuring no grain was withheld, or priests scolding sinful entertainments too bawdy for holy eyes. Even events meant to cheer carried edges of fear. Imagine one day of trying to trade honestly while constantly checking your pouch for theft, your food for inspection, your words for scandal. Exhausting. As the afternoon progresses, you might witness another public gathering, a legal punishment. Perhaps a thief condemned to stand in the stocks, his feet and hands locked in wooden boards, exposed for mockery. The people throw rotten vegetables, jeer, laugh cruelly. These were not just punishments. They were carnivals of shame meant to reinforce authority. Or worse, you could happen upon an execution. A hanging perhaps, or in larger towns, even a burning. Harsh punishments were considered crucial to keep order. To us, it is grim beyond tolerance. For medieval folk, it was a strange blend of justice, ritual, and horribly entertainment. Spending just one day absorbing such spectacle would weigh on any sensitive mind. Beyond the towns, the forests loomed. Today, perhaps while travelling home from market, you pass near one. Forests, then, were not peaceful hiking retreats, but wild realms of hazard and superstition. Wolves prowled, bandits lurked, and the canopy plunging paths into eerie shadow fed fearful imaginations. Folklore said spirits lived there, witches gathered at night, and fairies tricked travelers astray. The sense of the unknown was overwhelming. To us, raised with satellite maps and paved roads, to step into even a half-mile of medieval woodland would spark unease faster than we care to admit. To them, it was danger and necessity at once, a place to hunt, forage, or cut timber, but never without risk. Returning home, you would spend evening hours with the family, repairing what broke during day. Nothing was disposable. Every worn strap of leather, every chipped tool, every frayed net had to be mended. Life admitted no replacements without expense. To see a plough crack or a pot shatter was not mild inconvenience, but disaster. Imagine a modern person frantically trying to repair every single object rather than tossing it aside. That constant requirement, maintenance, endless thrift, would be exhausting immediately. And then there were the laws of diet shaped by religion. Imagine learning that today is part of a fast. No meat is allowed. For entire weeks of Lent, this denial stretched long, punctuated by simple bread, fish, pulses, and sparse fare. For us, who can casually shrug off restrictions with alternatives and luxuries, enduring mandatory fasting, imposed not by personal choice, but by communal expectation, would weaken both body and spirit. Even one day of restricted appetite would make the belly roar with protest. At night, as villagers gather together briefly before bed, stories turn perhaps darker. Tales of saints burning away devils, of sinful neighbors falling under curses, of miraculous interventions from heaven to rescue crops. Children listen wide-eyed, adults nod sagely, everyone soaking in the shared worldview. Everything is steeped in divine trial and blessing. For the modern mind, used to explanations in science and logic, spending even one day steeped in such beliefs would feel dizzying. There is little room for doubt, less for skepticism. To speak it aloud could be dangerous. Heresy was no idle accusation. Imagine carefully crafting your words every hour of the day, avoiding even joking blasphemies, knowing one slip could cost dearly. We'd last perhaps an hour before letting something too modern slip. You crawl again onto the straw pile, your muscles sore not only from physical work, but from constant inward restraint. The murmurs of livestock drift in through cracks. A child coughs in the dark. Wolves howl faintly in a forest beyond fields. You clutch your corner of blanket and mutter whatever scraps of prayers come to you, not because the faith is yours, but because fear dominates everything. Closing your eyes, you accept, reluctantly, that another day is survived. But the effort has carved hollows into your patience. How long before you collapse entirely, unable to endure hunger, monotony, suspicion, and fear all woven into one endless cycle? Even one more day feels like too much. Yet for medieval men and women, it was simply life, endured without choice. Their quiet endurance makes us marvel and shudder at how fragile we truly would be in their place. A new day dawns, though it hardly feels new at all. It simply continues, rolling over like the wheel of a cart that never stops turning. By now, the rhythm of medieval life has pressed upon you so deeply that it's difficult to imagine anything outside this haze of labor, fear, and communal necessity. For the people who truly lived it, this was existence itself. For us, simply imagining it leaves one drained. But to carry on, we must step a bit closer, seeing how even leisure, learning, and love were colored by this world in ways foreign to us. This morning might begin, if you are of noble birth, with training. From the moment a boy was old enough, he could be shaped toward knighthood. Imagine yourself being sent, perhaps at the age of 7, to another castle to serve as a page. Far from your family, you begin instruction in courtesy, hawking, hunting, and serving at table. You polish armor, learn to carry messages, and receive relentless training in loyalty. Later, in adolescence, you might be promoted to squire, entrusted to care for a knight's horse and equipment, and even accompany him into battle. Chivalry sounds gleaming in story, yet to live it was far harsher. Strict discipline, physical exhaustion, and, at times, the cruelty of serving as expendable shield-bearer to someone else's glory. For a modern youth, accustomed to long years of protected schooling, the harshness of adolescence as servitude would feel crushing after a single sunrise. Girls of noble households faced their own expectations. Many were betrothed in childhood, marriages arranged to stitch political alliances, the girls' desires scarcely considered. Raised carefully in dress, deportment, and household management, they were shaped into keys for dynastic locks. To imagine for us, the loss of freedom in love or marriage, even for a single day, is harrowing, and yet to resist would be almost unthinkable. In villages too, marriage was rarely a free romance. Families sought stability, alliances between neighbours, and the quiet assurance that enough land and food would sustain new households. Love surely grew between some couples, but it was not the guiding principle. To live one day where duty overshadowed personal longing so completely would remind us how radically different their world was. Now, consider education. By our standards, it was sparse. A boy of privilege might attend a cathedral school, chanting his way through endless psalms in Latin, copying manuscripts until his eyes blurred in candlelight. Grammar, rhetoric, and logic formed the bedrock. For peasants, education came only in the fields, learning when to plough, when to sow, how to weave baskets or mend fences. For girls, learning meant skills of the house, spinning, weaving, brewing, child-rearing. Books were rare and precious, each hand-copied, each line a labour of months or years. To us, who live on words printed and streamed in abundance, the silence of one day without reading, without private study, would gnaw at the mind. For them, it was simply the natural order. Knowledge belonged to the few. The rest lived stories side by side rather than written line by line. Leisure, too, carried the mark of difference. While modern leisure often means indulgence, relaxation, or entertainment without consequence, medieval leisure was steeped in community and season. The May Day dances, midsummer fires, or harvest feasts were more than fun. They were survival for the spirit, binding the collective heart together under moments of light. At these times, rules bent slightly. Allée flowed, laughter echoed, mischief sometimes unfolded in corners. For peasants, such moments were remembered long afterward and carried them through lean winters. For us, accustomed to choice and variety in daily leisure, one day of enforced festival might still seem vibrant, but a year with only one or two such distractions would weigh the spirit down until even joy carried a thread of desperation. As we move through the imagined day, the materiality of medieval life presses harder. You notice how scarce metal is. Nails, knives, buckles, all rare, all carefully reused. Wood and wool dominate the senses. Wood burning, creaking underfoot, splintering into tools. Wool scratching against skin, heavy when wet, smelling faintly of lanolin. Shoes are stiff leather if lucky, often patched repeatedly. Utensils are wood or horn. Even mirrors, small discs of polished metal, barely reflect your face. Imagine trying to live one day without being able to clearly see yourself, without the certainty of your own reflection. The people of this world knew themselves not from mirrors or photographs, but from how others described them. Their identity was communal, not individual. Truly, the idea of self as we know it now, with selfies, profiles, entire lives curated individually, would dissolve after a single medieval sunrise. In the afternoon, you might wander near a monastery. These were formidable presences, not only religious, but also intellectual and economic. Cloistered monks farmed, brewed ale, copied texts, and provided hospitality for travellers. Within the cool stone walls lasted the rhythm of bells, prayer, and silence. Hours punctuated the day. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, each prayer like a heartbeat, dictating the tempo of monastic existence. Visitors might glimpse the vast contrast. Outside, chaos and squalor. Inside, order and silence. But even monks bore hardship. A single day of monastic schedule involved hours kneeling on cold stone, cutting back appetite to austere meals, and obeying ceaseless silence. For us, used to freedom of voice, even one day struck forcibly silent could feel unbearable. Yet these communities preserved knowledge and provided structure to a chaotic world. The evening again descends with the weight of medieval night. Before sleep, there is little light, perhaps one tallow candle sputtering, its smoke sour and heavy. Families huddle close, some whispering quiet stories, others too weary even for words. Bed is once again straw or rushes, perhaps sharing space with farm animals for warmth. The air is close, damp and coarse. You close your eyes with no illusion of privacy, no pretense of comfort, only exhaustion drawing you over the cliff into slumber. To us, the indignity and itch of such conditions might break resolve after one exposure. But in that world, it was simply the blanket everyone shared, from birth until death. As you drift, you realize something new. The difficulty is not merely in the labor or hunger, not merely in the harsh rules of religion and lordship. It is in the constancy, the unbending, unchanging weave of a world that never loosens its grip. Work, prayer, obedience, repetition, day after day. To last a whole lifetime in this was an achievement few acknowledged. It was survival hidden by silence. For us, even one day is dizzying, yet for them it was all days. And with that, your heavy eyes close, heart uneasy but grateful, knowing tomorrow will begin again exactly the same. The medieval wheel grinding ever onward. Morning again, though. Morning barely feels distinct anymore when the days roll in cycles, so similar they blur. You wake with the usual stiffness, scratching of wool, and pale light dripping past slats of wood. By now, even your imagination might sigh with exhaustion. The essence of medieval existence has seeped deep. But the world of this age wasn't only poverty, hardship, and monotony. There were also moments of aspiration, towering gestures of devotion and power that still astound us today. To survive even one day surrounded by them might be overwhelming in a very different way. Imagine this morning, you rise not in a peasant's home, but as a townsman near an immense cathedral under construction. From the moment you step outside, you hear the clatter of chisels on stone, the groan of wooden scaffolding, the chants of labourers hauling ropes. Some cathedrals took centuries to complete. Whole generations were born and died working on stones they would never see finished. The ambition to build upward toward heaven was unmatched, but the physical toll was staggering. Masons carried blocks, carpenters balanced precariously on beams, glaziers crafted stained windows luminous with colour like liquid fire. Even the peasants, who may never have owned so much as a personal book, contributed in coin, taxes, or labour. For a modern visitor, one day amidst such overwhelming effort might bring awe, but also claustrophobia. How could a society so resource-poor pour so much of itself into stone towers, while villagers starved? Yet it worked, for the soaring spires gave hope that transcended worldly hardship. Nearby, education bloomed in cloisters and nascent universities. Picture scholars in woolen gowns debating long into the night, not science as we know it, but philosophy, theology, the words of Aristotle blended with sacred scripture. A single day as a student at the University of Paris or Oxford involved endless recitation, grueling disputations, ink-stained fingers, and minds stretched taut with abstract logic. For us, the lack of modern tools, no libraries teeming with millions of books, no internet with instant resources, would frustrate quickly. Each scrap of parchment was precious. Copying one text could take months. Imagine one day of trying to live intellectually under that scarcity, and the weight of limited access to knowledge would feel suffocating. Yet to them, it was a privilege beyond price. But not all gatherings of people were so lofty. Imagine instead that today you find yourself swept into a pilgrimage. Pilgrimages were journeys to holy shrines. Canterbury, Santiago, Rome, even Jerusalem if fortune and wealth allowed. The road filled with motley travellers, knights, paupers, widows, students, merchants. Songs rose as they marched, prayers whispered at wayside crosses, relics kissed reverently in roadside chapels. Yet it was also dangerous. Bandits stalked these processions. Sickness spread among cramped lodgings. Weather-battered travellers endlessly. A modern traveller might find the communal spirit uplifting for a few hours, but enduring the blistered feet, foul-smelling hostels, and ever-hovering thieves would crush the adventure quickly. Still, pilgrimages gave medieval people taste of a larger world and the comfort of shared faith, all crammed into days of weary marching. Not every spectacle was holy. Festivals often mingled sacred ritual with earthy chaos. Think of a feast of fools, celebrated in some towns. Priests briefly mocked, processions turned upside down, choirs parodied with comic songs, and ordinary folk allowed to parody authorities in raucous revelry. For one day, at least, the rigid hierarchy loosened, though usually only to remind everyone how firmly it held the rest of the year. To us, spending a day amidst this carnival inversion would seem a curious relief from discipline, yet its intensity might also overwhelm, like trying to laugh away months of hunger all at once. Alongside such diversions lurked more ominous gatherings, inquisitions, or witch hunts. If unfamiliar words slipped, if neighbours whispered, suspicion could bring investigation. A trial could be an ordeal of water, cast into a river to see if you floated, proof of guilt, or it could be subtle intimidation, questioning your prayers and practices until you faltered. Just one day under suspicion would break us. To them, the constant possibility was another shadow on life. The line between festival and fate swung invisibly. And what of medicine in larger towns? Barber surgeons moved from shaving faces to cutting into flesh, pulling teeth with no anesthetic beyond ale or biting wood. Apothecaries lined jars with herbs, mercury, and powders that might help or harm more than they healed. To endure a tooth extraction or even a fever one day in that era tested courage to the core. Imagine gritting teeth until they cracked, because the alternative was the surgeon's crude tools. Pain was expected, almost demanded, a constant companion. Relief was rare, fleeting, and risky. Through the afternoon, the work of daily life continued unchanged. Carts creaked through rutted streets. Pigs squealed as they rooted in muck. Bells rang to mark canonical hours. Children darted in alleys, playing with hoops and sticks. Mothers scolded, fathers bargained, monks processed through with incense curling. All of it knitted together into a world vibrant and harsh. To pass one ordinary day here meant sensory overload. Constant sound, smell, and motion. No indoor calm, no private silence. To a modern ear, even one day would throb unbearably with noise and stink. So constant we'd cry for earplugs or a window that closed tight. As night descends, let's step into a larger household, maybe even a castle again. Here supper might be grand, whole roasted boar, spices dripping onto trenchers of bread, goblets lifted with wine. Bards sang, jesters cavorted, noble company exchanged sly remarks. Yet beneath the glamour lurked unease. Food often masked decay with heavy spices. Wine might be watered, bread adulterated with fillers, and at the high table, politics never rested. An arched eyebrow could seal friendship or doom an ambition. For us, one fancy dinner would dazzle, but the tension of knowing words were weapons as sharp as swords could unravel the appetite before dessert was served. Soon enough, torches gutter, tapestries hang stiff in the draughts, and individuals retreat again into the long night. Oil lamps smoke, straw rustles, prayers are murmured, and wolves howl faintly further off. With another day closed, you realize something bitter and humbling. Surviving here does not mean triumph. It simply means enduring. One day can contain beauty beyond words, terror enough for nightmares, and monotony enough to hollow you out. And for medieval men and women, this was not performance, but life itself. For us, who can hardly imagine going without hot baths, structured schools, medical care, or simple forks, the question repeats itself at every turn. Could we last even a full day here? The evidence continues to suggest not. Yet these people did, every day for centuries, building cathedrals stone by stone, tilling fields with bleeding hands, raising children under candlelight, and burying loved ones beneath cold stone crosses. Their resilience is what built the world we stand upon. Even as we marvel at how fragile our tolerance would be for even a single one of their days, another dawn breaks in our imagined journey, though by now you may feel the weight of all the days behind you. Each sunrise has brought with it labor, hunger, superstition, and repetition, and each evening has